Thank you, Armagan, and welcome back to the afternoon session. It's my privilege, actually, to introduce to you our keynote speaker for today, Chris Henderson, President of Lumos Energy. Chris is Canada's preeminent clean energy advisor to our Indigenous communities. He advises chiefs and councils, tribal groups, and Aboriginal economic development corporations on how to effectively secure and leverage partnership positions in clean energy projects across Canada. Chris also guides utilities, financial firms, corporations, and governments on engaging and partnering with Indigenous communities. Chris has catalyzed clean energy projects in every Canadian province and territory. His book, Aboriginal Power, published just recently, 2013, was recently published and is entitled Aboriginal Power. Chris is Program Director and Lead Mentor with the Indigenous Clean Energy 2020 Catalyst Program, a major initiative of Lumos to try and strengthen First Nations, Métis, and Inuit clean energy community readiness, community capacity, and leadership skills. For the past 25 years, Chris has been a Canadian eco-entrepreneur, community leader, and environmental innovator. He has been at the forefront of groundbreaking local and national Canadian business, social, and ecological initiatives that have had local and global impacts. I'm pleased to welcome Chris to make his remarks. Thank you.
So this guy gets up one morning and he realized that he's been dreaming about one thing all night. And he's been dreaming about the number 8. And he looks at his watch and he sees that he woke up at 8 minutes past 8 o'clock. As he wakes up, he realizes that it's the 8th day of the 8th month of the year. He's a betting man, and as he reads the morning papers, he looks at the horse races and he sees in race number 8, in the 8th spot, is a horse by the name of Lucky Number 8. So he goes to the bank and takes out all his money, $8,000. And he puts it on that lucky number 8. So do you know what happened? The horse came 8th. I don't want to talk to you about luck. I want to talk to you about opportunity that is actually happening with Indigenous communities around Canada in terms of how they're partnering with the development of renewable energy and advanced energy for their communities and for the country. And it's happening a lot faster than you may think. And in this regard, I want to take you through a bit of a landscape of the geography of Canada, because this has in fact been my travels this month alone. We're in the community of Nain, Labrador, which is on the east coast of the country, or the north coast of Labrador. There, the Aluksuak Cultural Center that they're building right now, solar hot water has been installed, solar PV is being installed, which will be a solar integrated building that will be a showcase and explain what solar power can do for that community and how they can participate in larger scale solar and wind power in Labrador to reduce their reliance on diesel fuel. Earlier this week, I was in my home in Ottawa, and there the Algonquins of Ontario are involved with helping develop diesel energy, district energy projects in downtown Ottawa. So the story of Indigenous energy across Canada is growing fast, very fast, and let me give you a few things that we can think about. First of all, the most important issue for Indigenous communities in the development of energy are Indigenous rights. What they're concerned about is that as we tap into the wealth of the land, the wealth of Mother Nature, solar, wind, water, biomass, geothermal, that respects their rights as the stewards of that land and their traditional title holders. This is obviously part of a national process that's underway, a reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation process. And you have in that respect for treaties, respect for the Canadian Constitution, and respect for the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and things like that. What Indigenous people have found is that has not been the case with energy development in the country to date, be it on hydrocarbons, be it on transmission, be it other forms of energy, including some forms of renewable energy. If you contrast what happened with James Bay 2 or Grand Baleine in Quebec and hydropower back in the 70s and 80s with the way hydropower is being developed today, it's very different because today there's much more respect for the role of Indigenous peoples. Now, I do need to make a disclosure. Some people look at me and say, especially Aboriginal people, ask me, say, Chris, where are you from? I said, with the Bombay Band. They said, where's that? I said, Bombay, because I'm the real Indian, you're the fake ones. It's a joke, they're okay with that. One Indian guy once said to me, he says, Chris, I don't mind that Christopher Columbus was looking for India and he found us. I'm glad he wasn't looking for the Virgin Islands. A tough crowd. You're the only one laughing around here. I'm going to stand beside this guy. This is if you look at the opposition that many Indigenous communities have to Northern Gateway or Energy East, and you ask the question, why? Well, some of you may be opposed to those projects. I am. Because ecologically, they don't respect values that are intrinsic to Indigenous communities. They don't respect how water, land, wildlife, fishery needs to be respected. And the energy sector has been a remarkable sector in its ingenuity and its investment in figuring out how engineering, and many of you are engineers, can extract resources, process them, transport them, and use them effectively. That's necessary but insufficient with the energy of this century. We still act in many ways in the energy sector as if we're in the 19th century, not even the 20th, but we are now in the 21st century. Or as Justin Trudeau says, it is 2015 from a gender standpoint, but we need to in fact have the energy sector catch up to as well. And for Indigenous communities, the importance of ecological integrity is key. The other force that's been a drive here, and the good news, is that we have had public policy and technology innovation in energy that has been profound. I'm going to put up some numbers shortly as to how many Indigenous clean energy projects exist around the country and what that means in terms of investment and jobs and economic and social return and development for Indigenous peoples and Canada. But suffice to say, that wouldn't happen unless governments and energy regulators, utilities, and others said, we value the role of Indigenous communities because of Indigenous rights and the values of ecological values. We value that differently today than we did 20 years ago or 30 years ago, even sometimes 10 years ago. And as a result, state-owned companies, state utilities or private utilities, a state-owned company like OPG or a privately owned one like ATCO, or a project developer like Brookfield Renewable Power, the largest renewable energy company in North America, the way they deal with Indigenous communities today is profoundly different in terms of recognizing how the Indigenous communities participate to give their consent in some form for the use of territory, be it for waterways, be it for solar use, be it for wind, be it for geothermal or biomass, and what their participation is in those projects in commercial terms and in terms of how the projects are decided and implemented. As a result of this, there is a spectrum of clean energy opportunities that are arising, principally in renewables, and I'll come back to that. But what that's done, it's having impacts. At the end of the day, energy, environment, and economy are integrally related. And what we see in this country today, in the good news story, is that the economic impacts that are being achieved by Indigenous participation in clean energy are not insignificant in terms of the amount of assets that Indigenous communities own of projects, the employment that deriving for that, and a range of other social, economic, and environmental benefits, including significant impacts on greenhouse gas reduction. So this is the landscape that you see here. the landscape of this country. So then I traveled in the last month to Labrador, Northern Quebec, Ontario, Northwest Territories, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, BC, and Ontario, that's pretty well most of the country. That landscape in geographic terms is now being translated into a landscape of energy in terms of Indigenous participation. But that's also good for Canada and it's good for energy. And that energy evolution that's underpinning is more profound because that process has just started. There's a spectrum, there's a landscape of Indigenous energy, and there's a spectrum of Indigenous clean energy. What I've mostly been talking about so far is renewable energy projects. But let's talk a little bit about those before I talk about the other 3 points of this compass. So today there are about 165 medium to large scale renewable energy projects that are owned in part or whole by Indigenous communities in Canada. As those forces of change, Indigenous rights, the landscape of ecology, policy has driven that. So I'll give you an example. If you drive west in Ontario and you head toward the Manitoba border, and you go a little bit south towards the United States, you come to the town of Rainy River, or the Rainy River First Nation. Chief Jim Leonard from the Rainy River First Nation has led his community to develop 30 megawatts of solar power, competing for bids that the Ontario Energy Authorities have led. And he's developed those projects, and they're 100% owned by the First Nation. He raised $170 million of equity and debt to put that project up. And that project was built in majority measure by Indigenous employment. All the people running the project now are Indigenous. It generates around $2 to $3 million a year of net earnings for the community, which goes into social, economic, and other benefits, and more over time as long-term debt's written down. To me, this is an element of community power in a sense. I mean, this Indigenous ownership is maybe no different than a cooperative like you have in Toronto for renewable energy or in Ottawa or other places, but it's owned by the community. There are hundreds of smaller projects. I'm not even referring to the small fit projects that a number of Indigenous communities are involved in, particularly here in Ontario, or small projects that are on roof mounts and things like that. This is just, the 165 relates to larger projects that are 1 megawatt or larger. And in some cases, the Indigenous communities are 100% owners. Most of the time, they are co-owners with private developers or state authorities. And in some cases, they are deriving benefits, but they aren't necessarily owners. The average ownership we're seeing is in the range of 25%, conservatively going to around 35% of these projects. And our estimate that we've seen about 7,000 jobs in construction created as those projects were built over the last decade or two. So from an economic perspective and social investment, that's been about $30 billion. Those are big numbers, and more to come. Though we'll probably see the renewable energy growth plateau in Canada over the next few years, certainly in Ontario, in BC. You'll probably see Alberta come up a little bit, Saskatchewan come up a little bit. But the bigger growth in renewable energy has probably occurred in Canada so far. We won't see the rate of growth in the next 10 decades, next 10 years, what it was in the last decade. But I mentioned to you that there's a spectrum, and I talked to you about renewable energy. But I think from what I saw in this Energy Day today, and when I talked to Nigel and Jatin, in terms of your program, there are 3 other points of any compass. This is only the northern point. So what's in the 3 other points that we're seeing in Indigenous energy? The first, and we had this partly in the presentation on buildings and energy efficiency and conservation. There are about 250 First Nations that are co-owners of clean energy projects, 1 megawatt or larger. But every First Nation, every home, every community can benefit from better design, better practices, better end-use technologies and infrastructure in terms of efficiency and conservation. You probably all know that's a much higher rate of return per $1 million of investment than in renewable energy. So now we're seeing the movement take place where people are driving more into energy efficiency and conservation. But there's more. We're now seeing this movement in green energy infrastructure. I'm going to leave that to the panel because some people are going to be talking about aspects of that infrastructure that deal with issues like transmission, where again, Indigenous communities want to be part of that. I'll give you a concrete discussion. I mean, there was a discussion I was in on Monday. It was with a utility, and it was with an Aboriginal community and a company like ABB, Isaiah Brown Bovary with microgrid management for an off-grid community as to how microgrids are going to be integrated with that facility for, in this case, an off-grid diesel community. So you're seeing green energy infrastructure come online. And then you're seeing growth with advanced energy systems. In Ottawa, there are 4 or 5 major urban developments: Rockcliffe Air Base, which is being rebuilt into 4,000 homes, a Greystone Village in the Rideau Canal, Zibi near the Ottawa River, and these developments will all require heat and power capacity. In a different electrification economy, the Indigenous communities who still have title to that land, this unceded Algonquin territory, are saying, hey, we'd like to be involved, but be involved in commercial terms. And if I tell you that 165 projects, there's virtually no government money in. And there may be elements of helping with the renewable transition in terms of the rate base that's been supporting it, but this is no free ride. This is a commercial operation of a different form of partnership than has been the case in the past. So that's my simple message, and I'm actually going to end soon to see what questions you have, because here's the opportunities that I would underline for people in research in the university, the convening power of the university, and the role of faculty and students in advancing knowledge, and then also bringing on great talent that can bring solutions forward. Because in this spectrum, there are opportunities in terms of energy storage, there are opportunities in terms of end-use systems, infrastructure design, as well as energy generation. So that's the story of Indigenous energy in Canada. If you want to plug into that, you can. And you can go to indigenousenergy.cleanenergy.com. I launched last week the Indigenous Clean Energy Network, which our company is helping coordinate with dozens of partners. And that network will allow someone to come and connect with others who have ideas to solve in a collaborative mode that's more interactive. So the Indigenous Clean Energy Network, and that's the URL, sorry that was fast, will do 3 things. There's a bunch of information there now. If a community wants to know, is solar power for us, or how can we do energy efficiency, it's there now. There's going to be tools and resources, but the real one I'd underline is what's in the center here, which is these action forums. Collaboration is a really overused word. What does it mean? To move with those other areas of the quadrants. With energy, we think in silos. But energy is systemic. But we don't approach solutions systemically. And the systemic solution has technological dimensions, it has economic dimensions, and it has policy dimensions and community dimensions. But the typical way that we approach energy futures is we've thought about, let's create more generation, like we did with renewable energy, or let's get an energy storage solution. My view, and what I put to you as a thesis, is that what you really want to look at is the evolution of energy to the electrification economy that we're going towards, to recognize that the only way we'll get to the real solutions we want without incredible dislocation and dysfunction and stranded assets and pain and people that may kick out governments because of power rates. The only way we won't have that situation is if we're collaborating differently. And so at least in the sphere of Indigenous communities and their involvement in the clean energy sector, we've created the Clean Energy Network to do that. And so there will be a forum, for example, on off-grid diesel reduction in terms of how we collaborate to do that more effectively, because it's systemic. And the solutions may be from a technology firm, it may be from the community itself, it may be from the utility, it may be from a technology provider. It's finding how those matches work. The conventional procurement, RFP, regulatory, linear approach will likely be insufficient to meet the opportunity that there is to move to a 21st century electrification economy that is truly climate combative. That's my story. I'd like to stop there and see if I can answer questions for you. If you want to know what's happening with Indigenous energy across the country, if you want to know what we're seeing in terms of the evolution process. But I'd particularly like to end my remarks before interacting by stressing that the role of the universities here, and particularly in the case here of University of Waterloo, I think there's a challenge to faculty. There's a challenge to faculty to appreciate that while the past is informing the present and guiding the future, that we have to have faculty interacting way more closely to the change process that's underway here and vice versa, which is why I have no difficulty when Jiten extends the invitation to say, come to campus. I'd like to see more faculty interacting with Indigenous communities, with the electricity sector, with the energy sector out there. Because the role of faculty in research is critical. There are many things we don't know. And therefore, the knowledge, convening power, and the research capacity of universities is key. From the standpoint of students, many of you will be saying, if you're graduate students, undergrads, or doing docs or postdocs, One, if you're doing docs or postdocs, some of your research will be material, and as probably a graduate student I'm talking to once or twice every month about their research in this sphere. But I would also say to you that talent counts. I would just say to you, if you are not Indigenous, like I am not, though my wife Andrea gave me a gift of my DNA from the National Geographic a couple of years ago for Christmas. We did the DNA, we found my ancestors, family's ancestors, as you would expect. They came from Africa, they went to Europe, they went to India, but along the way, some of them then went into Siberia, across Beringia, and went to the Yukon. So I'm officially 5% Native American. Some Native American guy says, no, Chris, that's not the way it happened. We went down and did our business down there, and anyway. So when you look at those histories that we all have, we have to see how those fit together. And to my mind, that the role of talent here, if you're looking to apply your talent in a sector like clean energy with Indigenous communities, do it with Indigenous communities. Don't come and say, I'm a really smart person, I've been to university, I know the solution, I've created a company, and say, here's what you should do. Indigenous communities want to be interactive with that process. So I do think that the role of universities and the University of Waterloo is critical in this, is that the energy evolution that I've described, particularly as it relates to Indigenous energy, will require ingenuity, insight, and the intuition of thought. And that is the heart of the university. Let me stop there and answer any questions you may have or comments you may have. And I welcome contrarian thoughts, because that is, of course, what university should be about. Thank you. If there's no questions, I'm really not going to be very happy.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more about getting faculty to collaborate
Great.
with non-academics. I'm wondering about the policy structures, though, since I work in policy. So you said that most of the projects that you look at are not predominantly government funded, that they're finding funding sources elsewhere. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about those funding sources, and what do you view as a potential positive role for government could be? So what sorts of policies would actually be helpful?
Great. A few things. Within the electricity sector, there have been policy decisions been made by governments or by energy regulators to incentivize the transition to renewable energy. And so Ontario's situation would be the feed-in tariff program or the large renewables procurement program. And in those cases, there is, in effect, is a very intentional decision to have some subsidy of the rate base towards renewable power. There also was Ontario policy that gave incentive to have Indigenous communities. You get extra points if an Indigenous partner is in your bid, for example, in the large renewables procurement process. But if you want to bid, then it's commercial. And so the way this has been, where the funding of larger projects that I've referred to have been done, is typically energy developers or utilities have gone to Indigenous communities and said, you have a really good solar resource, or you're near a transmission line connection and transformer station, or you've got a hydro resource or a biomass resource. Would you partner with us? We'll be the general partner. We'll partner with you. We'll fund the development. And then we'll compete, and if we win, and we win partly because of your involvement, you have a share of the project, and you have a chance to buy in equity. And the buying of equity could either be financed by the developer, it could be borrowed on markets. There are subsidy programs, but supportive programs. There's like a sovereign guarantee fund in Ontario, the loan guarantee program. There's the First Nations Finance Authority nationally, which is based out of Vancouver. So we have, where you're partnering in larger projects, the project development relationships are key. And those are the basis of development. So if you need $2 or $3 or $4 million to develop a project to bid it, that's going to come from the developer. And part of what we do in our company is we help Indigenous communities forge those partnerships so they're fair. If a community wants to develop their own project, and a smaller project, it's a bit more of a challenge. So there has been some government money in Ontario, in this province, also federally, and those have been supportive. Where does this go? I think the opportunity really is in about 3 areas for government policy to support Indigenous communities fully take advantage of the spectrum. The first is related to capacity development and really building the scale of Indigenous communities to be true partners in relationships, where there are people in the communities that are, you'll hear one in the next panel, who are catalysts, who are helping lead their communities and lead Indigenous communities forward. The second role of government, I believe, is with off-grid diesel communities. I do believe that both federal and provincial governments, and we're seeing developments in Ontario, we'll hear about more shortly, that really need to look at how you move diesel reduction. And that requires a different set of solutions than power that's grid connected. It has a different financial parameter, has a different policy parameter. And the third thing I'd underline for governments is that understand that the Indigenous role and participation and and you could say Indigenous and you could say communities, which could be municipalities and local communities. There's a lot of analogousness between those two. In fact, the people who are not taking advantage of a lot of this change, in my view, are municipalities. There are very few municipalities that are really realizing where their role in the future electrification economy is. There's a few LDCs and a few community groups like, Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op that are there, but by and large, most communities are not. Guelph's a standout, though I would say Guelph is probably the leader in Ontario in terms of its local involvement. But if you're going to be moving towards electrification on transport, if you're going to be moving towards district energy planning, if you're going to be using advanced energy infrastructure, you need a public process, a civic process that engages different peers. So I'd say those three areas of policy and program for government are key: Indigenous support and capacity, off-grid diesel, and the evolution of communities towards a decentralized energy economy.
Sure. There's one more
One?
question.
I'm Michael Angemeyer from the utility of Veridian, and I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
Are you looking to take some of your concepts and things that you're putting together for clean energy and then apply them to water as well?
It's a great question. I am not. I've learned that I should stick to what I know, because when I touch things I don't know, I'm incompetent. But I do think the principles, Michael, that you've underlined in terms of water is a great one. I mean, there is another company I started called the Delphi Group, which dealt with broad-based environmental issues that still exist around the country, and water was among the things we touched. But I would say that some of the principles of Indigenous involvement, community involvement, demand-side management, conservation in water are as important as they are in energy. How to do it, I defer to people that are located in the water sector, but if there's an opportunity to share ideas, that's a great idea.
Any more questions? One more? Sure.
Hi, I'm Shadi Al-Qadri, Sauti. Thank you for the talk. Quick question. It's good to see the government doing so much in terms of encouraging Indigenous involvement in this sector. The question is, are there enough incentives or programs for these projects to involve Canadian technologies, whether they're hardware or software, that to execute on them?
Well, the short answer would be no, and it goes beyond Indigenous, of course. I mean, it's really a question of how procurement and both development of technologies works. It's a question that both, the Center for Innovation, SDDC, and other people are looking at. From a procurement standpoint, when we deal with them, we deal with technologies that are tried, tested, and true. And so therefore, they've made it past beta scale and they made it past full market scale. So that's where we get involved when we're doing a commercial project. But should we see more technology development? There's no doubt about that. This is a bedeviling one. I don't work in the heart of the innovation sector, but I'm very familiar with it. And in terms of energy innovation, how we do that, I don't have easy answers. It doesn't appear that many people do. We're all saying it's a problem to solve. The question is, how do we do it? But should we do it? I mean, on Monday evening, I'll be chairing a meeting in Toronto with 15 CEOs and Minister Morneau to have that discussion about how in the energy sector we move this faster. Was that? Absolutely. Well, I mean, to my mind, innovation period is the answer. Let's scale innovation faster. And how do we get it so that there's both a demand pull and a supply push that make that effective? I think demand pull can be very effective. I mean, just one final thing about Jatan. We've got a technology, for example, that's made of a California company, not Canadian. I'm a little less agnostic about Canadian. I just want innovation to move faster. This is a low-speed RPM diesel motor. I mean, Klaus may have heard about it last week in WT. I like the idea that we've been using diesel motors were invented in 1896. So for 125 years, we've been using the same technology. Really? Really? Have we used anything for 125 years except for wood? I don't know. But, so this company just basically come up with a new technology that has a demand as a supply curve that matches the demand curve in a diesel context. We'll see if it works. But at least Northwest Territories Power paid the money to make sure there's a full test of that. So that's what we need to do, both demand pull, and supply push. Thanks very much. Tatan, I know we've got to move.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your thoughtful remarks in a very short period of time. You really were able to connect all the key big dots, if you wish, to really try and put your arm around the issue of clean energy transitions, technology, policy, specific projects, and how some of this thing works, but with the lens of how this will play itself out in our Indigenous communities in Canada. And it's very thought-provoking and a wonderful talk, so I'd like to thank you for your remarks. Just stay still because you're going to be moderating the next session. Before we get there, I would encourage the panelists to begin to converge this way so we can save a few minutes. And in the intervening period, I have 2 or 3 things to say. First, a bribe that after the session ends, there is a reception to follow. So please make sure that you have something to drink before you are on the road. Drink reasonably, as it were. But there is the innovation showcase, and please try and take a bit of time to visit the booths and talk to the students and the projects that are underway. They've put in a lot of effort to try and make their results and enthusiasm of the research that they are doing available to you for discussion. So take this opportunity to visit the innovation booth before you hit the road. And one more in between before we get the panel going that Chris will moderate in a moment. I would like to invite Julie Wright at the Waterloo Global Science Initiative to highlight for you the open access blueprint that was just issued yesterday, so you can, and she'll tell you all about it. But it also links very clearly into this issue and challenge of provision of energy access, energy services in our Indigenous communities, which are distant, dispersed, and often a challenge, and they're mostly based on diesel. So Julie, you might want to.
Thank you very much, Jatine. As you heard from Chris, there's a huge amount of opportunities at play right now, especially when we're looking at remote communities and energy access. So the organization that I'm representing here today, the Waterloo Global Science Initiative, is a nonprofit organization, a partnership between University of Waterloo and the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. And we function as a mini think tank where we will reach out to researchers here in Waterloo and around the world. We bring them together as a multi-stakeholder group around a complex problem space. And our goal is to generate actionable, sustainable solution pathways. So over the last 2 years, we've been focusing on energy access globally, which is SDG 7. And our goal was to really deeply examine how to improve the provision of quality energy services globally. And that encompassed our own backyard. When we look at remote Indigenous communities across Canada, this has been an intractable problem for decades, and as Chris was explaining, and as the panel that's coming up will further clarify, there are some really great opportunities on the table. So we spent the last 2 years working on this document, and there are a number of contributors to the document in the room today. Nigel Moore was one of our lead authors. Mariano Arriaga did the chapter on Indigenous remote energy, and Shiva Kumar is here. And so we're deeply thankful for those contributions and also for Jatine and Chris's guidance throughout it. So we do have a number of copies in the back corner. You're welcome to pick these up. The document itself outlines really 4 key strategies in tackling SDG 7. Proactive governance, the development of fair markets, how to empower people globally, and how success can be achieved through diversity, a portfolio of options. There are also a number of solution spotlights in the back, so if you're looking at examples of companies that have succeeded in difficult market conditions, there's some really great examples. So I encourage you to take a look. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Now my privilege to invite Chris Henderson and the panel to please join us here on the podium. This is a subject that's dear to my heart. Energy access for Canada's remote communities, and I say provocatively, if not now, when? We cannot wait any longer. And I'm sure each of the panelists will be really up to the task to shed some insights on how we can literally break this historical logjam that has been with us for the last number of decades. So I look forward to the observations of both the panelists, and Chris will moderate this, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jiten. We're going to jump right in, and I'm going to introduce the panel as a whole right now, and then they'll in turn speak, and we'll go interactive after all four have spoken. So it's my delight to be on this panel with Tabitha Bull, who's from the Nipissing First Nation in terms of her home community. But her role here today is as the First Nations and Métis Relations Coordinator Manager for the Independent Electricity Systems Operator, and it's my pleasure also to serve on the board of ISO, and we look forward to Tabitha's remarks first, followed by Cara Saunders, who's associate with our company, the Lumos Energy, who'll be talking about her experience with the 2020 Catalyst program. And then here at home himself, Claudio Canizas, professor with electrical and computer engineering with the University of Waterloo. Claudio's done some incredible work in the far north of Canada in terms of looking at opportunities for technology and innovation. I expect to be talking about those. And finally, Klaus Doring, president of Green Sun Rising, who we were together in Northwest Territories last week for our program. But Klaus will be talking about solar energy and the innovation potentials there. So welcome our panel, and I'm going to turn right away over to Tabitha to jump right in. Tabitha.
Ani Buju, Tabitha Indigenous, Nipissing Indinjaba, Mijisi Dodem. Thank you, and thanks for having me. I've just said my name is Tabitha Bull. I'm from the community of Nipissing First Nation, and I'm the family of the Eagle. I want to first acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee people. And at the risk of getting emotional, I want to say it's really great to be here. I got my engineering degree from University of Waterloo, and my plan was always to work with First Nation people in my own community to help through my engineering degree, so it's kind of coming full circle to be back here and talking about this project. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on the remote communities in Ontario. There are currently 25 off-diesel communities in Ontario. We say remote, but that's really speaking to the off-grid communities. So there are two communities who are remote, White Sand and Gull Bay, but they have road access, but they are still standalone diesel generation. And then there are three communities on the James Bay coast, Saskatchewan, Attawapiskat, and Fort Albany, which are fly-in communities, but do have grid connection, and they got grid connection in November of 2001 through Five Nations Energy. I think I'll touch a little bit on the conditions in communities, and I think this has probably been spoken about already today, and our fellow panelists will speak to this as well. Just a little bit about the conditions with diesel fuel in these communities. 15 of the 25 communities are currently operated by Hydro One remotes, and 10 are operated by an independent power authority. Most often their own community operates the system. When a community gets to 85% of its prime rating of its generation facilities, it's put on what's called capacity restriction. And when that happens, new homes that are built, even though the community may have funding to build new homes, they cannot connect those new homes to the system any longer. So in some communities, we've heard of those homes being built but not being able to be heated. And because of the strong freeze-thaw cycle, a lot of those communities, those homes get mold and are never able to be lived in. Also, because of the growing population in these communities, you do have some homes with 2 to 3 families living in one to 2 bedroom home. Some of the other conditions with capacity restriction are there is some industry and mines near these communities, and these communities could support and grow their economic development in supporting those mines if they were able to build economic development, potentially catering or additional services to provide to these industries, but based on being on capacity restriction, they're limited in their ability to do that. And also the rotational use of electricity. So in some of those communities that are on capacity restriction, they've actually developed a schedule for youth and teens to be able to use the internet at home, or the times that they're allowed to watch TV at home. And that's going to, any time, as anyone would know, your sleep cycle is very important, and those type of conditions can lead to some of the things we're hearing about in the news today. Additionally, the reliability in a lot of those communities with outages lasting more than 48 hours. These are communities who are mostly electric heat, shorter days, so they need the longer light. And there's a lot of elders in those communities who have medical reasons that they need electricity all the time. So it is leading to a lot of elders who are on dialysis or other medical conditions that need reliable electricity, that have to leave their homes and move away, which again is a systemic issue to the youth developing in those communities. On top of that is environmental aspects, which I know you've spoken about a lot today. The risks of spills on the winter roads and the storage in the community. And of course, the emissions associated with diesel generator. On the cost issue, we are seeing a rise in cost in the diesel fuel availability due to the climate change and the reduced time for winter roads, where it often used to be 2 months that you would be able to have a winter road. In some communities in recent winters, they've seen as short of 2 to 3 weeks. So that's the time that they would need to be able to get the majority of their diesel there, and without that, they're having to fly a lot more diesel in, which is increasing the costs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in these communities around reducing diesel. So in 2008, a committee was formed by local tribal councils and some independent communities called the Northwestern Ontario First Nation Technical Panel Committee, with the support of OPA and under the leadership of Colin Henderson, who was our CEO at that time. And at that time, every time I heard him spoke, this was one of the key priorities of him and the company, so thank you, Colin. Since in 2010, based on the committee's early work, the Ontario Minister of Energy directed the OPA, now the IESO, to formally evaluate a remote connection plan and develop a business case for that plan. So we worked with this technical panel committee to develop the remote connection plan, also to visit a number of the remote communities and to discuss the connection, discuss the plan. We've developed some documentation, summary documentation, and also some translated versions of the plan as well in Oji Cree and Cree for the elders of the communities. Because as Chris said, it really is about getting community buy-in and community understanding, and understanding what the impacts are to their territorial lands and hunting and fishing. The plan was released to the public in the summer of 2013, and it was updated publicly in August of 2014. So I'm not going to go in too much detail on the technical parts of the plan, although I know we're a room of engineers. The plan is available on our website, and I did bring a number of the summary documents, which are about 20 pages. I have them at the back table if anybody wants to take one home. So the plan basically looks at conceptual routing of connection, and conceptual because the proponent who goes to build the project needs to do the significant environmental assessment, but also needs to talk to the elders, as I said, about exact routing in order to have the least amount of impact on their traditional way of life and on migratory patterns, caribou herding areas, and impacts to the water and river systems. So the plan looks at 3 groupings of connection. One is an area that connects to an existing station at Red Lake, and it will connect 6 existing diesel generating communities, plus 1 community, which is Matawa Lake, which is a smaller community that's currently not a number of people live there, but they're going to build a new community there. The second grouping is called the Pickle Lake sub-region, and it connects from an existing Pickle Lake station, but there is a requirement to develop a new transmission line along the same corridor as the existing Pickle Lake line, potentially, in order to be able to connect those additional communities. And that will connect 10 communities. And then there's what's called the Ring of Fire substation, which is the 5 remote Matawa communities. And they could potentially be connected from that same Pickle Lake station or from the south near Nipigon and Marathon. So the business case looked at alternative energies, renewable solutions, and what would be the best renewable solution depending on the community. It took the least cost option, and compared that to transmission connection and to offsetting of the cost of diesel, recognizing the growing load in the communities and the growing population. It found that there was an economic business case to connect 21 of the 25 communities. And the 4 communities that are currently non-economic to connect, I'll speak to that a little bit more in detail. They're all working on projects to reduce diesel in their own communities as well. So also, kind of to what Chris was speaking about First Nation-owned projects. There are currently 22 First Nation communities that have joined together to form Watanakineat Power, which is a lot of the communities that were originally involved in that First Nation Technical Panel Committee. And they've partnered with now Fortis Ontario to connect 16 of the current diesel stations plus McDowell Lake that I spoke about. The draft community connection plan informed an order in council this summer, the provincial government, and that order in council confirmed the need for the project. So that helps to streamline the project along through the OEB process. Normally in the OEB process, for a new transmission connection, there's a process where you have to continue to identify need and to prove the need. So with this order in council, it is able to streamline the process through the OEB. There was also a concurrent order in council from the provincial government who designated Watanakineat Power as the transmitter. This again, I think, is a great sign of provincial policy right now to ensure that these 22 First Nation communities are going to be the owners and operators of this project eventually. They're currently 51% majority owners, and their plan is to become 100% owners in the future. Construction is expected to begin on the first line to Pickle Lake, which is going to enable the remote connection in 2018, and the first communities are to be connected in 2021, with the remaining in 2023. There's one community that's a much larger community, Pikangikum First Nation, which you likely may have heard of recently in the news. They have a number of challenges on water and community infrastructure. There is work going forward to connect them earlier by the end of 2018, and ISO is supporting that work through our connection assessment processes. The Matawa First Nations are the communities near the Ring of Fire. They currently aren't part of the Watanakineat project, and part of that is they've had a lot of other priorities going forward. The Ring of Fire Secretariat that was being established with the federal government, and a lot of their focus has been on that work with Ring of Fire. Now they've come and they really want to understand energy and understand the potential for connection. So ISO has formed an energy working group with them, and we're working with them just to build education in the communities, to look at the options for renewable generation, to look at transmission, look at the different transmission options, either from the Pickle Lake area or from the south. And to do a lot of that early community engagement with elders and youth and community about awareness and options, and to understand if there is opposition to some of the options that are out there. Also to look at transportation corridors if the Ring of Fire does go forward, and where's the benefits to be able to align the transmission corridor with the transportation corridor, if so. I should note that the business case stands alone without the Ring of Fire development, so the business case did not look at the potential need for additional load with the mines. The 4 remote communities that are currently not economic to connect. So we're working with those 4 communities. 2 of them are on the top of the province, the coast of Hudson Bay, Fort Severn and Pewanik. And Fort Severn has a good community plan that they're working towards for solar and storage. They've started work on a small solar project with storage on their water treatment plant. And Winisk has also gone forward and said that they want to look at storage as well. We did a lot of work with them a couple summers ago in community engagement, and the elders in that community are very opposed to hydroelectric on their river system due to the fishing and their traditional uses of the river. The other 2 communities are the road access communities who are currently not economic to connect just based on the size of their community. So one of them is White Sand First Nation, and they're currently working on a biomass cogen facility with a wood pellet plant. And in December of 2015, the Minister of Energy directed the ISO to negotiate a power purchase agreement with them. So we've been working with them on purchasing the power from the cogen that will supply the pellet plant. Their project will offset all of the diesel use for the community homes and community infrastructure. And then the fourth community is Gull Bay First Nation, which is also a road access community. They're also working on a 300 kilowatt solar generation with storage project currently, and they're wanting to look at other options to connect to their microgrid as well. So we're hoping to support them in that project. So in terms of support, as you can see, it's a long process. The technical panel committee started in 2008, and construction is now looking to start in 2018. So that's been a long process, and support has been needed throughout the entire process. Some of the things that we're doing to help move these communities forward and help them with education and capacity and readiness for when they're connected. We have an Aboriginal Community Energy Plan program, which funds communities up to $95,000 to develop a community energy plan. A number of the remote communities have done this already and are working on them. And the Government of Ontario also directed us to develop a partnerships program, which provides funding to the 4 communities who are not economic to connect to look at projects, look at their options and feasibility and some project development, and also provides funding for communities to partner on transmission projects, so the Watanikinia project. But continued support is definitely needed to prepare the communities for connection in terms of conservation prior to their connection. When the previous communities on James Bay connected, they went from being on capacity restriction to having what seemed like an endless supply of energy, and they started using energy, always drying their clothes, not hanging their clothes. So in terms of an early conservation program prior to connections, the communities are prepared and prior to connection, and also education and additional training so that we can create as many jobs as possible out of some of these programs. I think I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. Miigwech.
Hi, good afternoon. Oops, very loud. My name is Cara Saunders. I'm a member of Carr Lake First Nations, just near Peterborough. I worked in consulting for many years, and I found that I didn't think that they were addressing the First Nation issues in a proper way. They would go more in and tell them what they should do, tell them how they should do it, not ask. It was a very standard approach that they took across the country, and Canada is very diverse, the people are very diverse, the remotes are different than the south, is different from the east, different from the west, and you have to approach them in different ways. So I decided I was going to go on my own, so I started a small company, me, and started focusing on Ontario and First Nations and focusing on the diesel-reliant communities, which is what Tabitha just spoke about. We in the south are in the land of plenty. There's a lot where whatever we want, like endless power, endless food, endless water, endless for us. There, it's a very different world. So in my research on the remotes and renewable energy, I came across Chris. I met Chris via the internet, and Chris started a program. Last year was the first summer. It was called the Catalyst 2020 program. So that's a picture of us at the Okikandot Hydro Project, which is at the Doki's First Nation French River area. So there's 18 catalysts in the program in first year. BC, the New Brunswick, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, we were all over. So that's a picture of all of us. And the focus of the program was building a community of practice, clean energy projects, partnerships, and planning. because I was new to this business, I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to get there. The map here, this is one of the days in class, and we're all sitting on the map of Canada, which is like almost as big as this room, on our homes. The program was 3 one-week sessions, one in Wakefield, Quebec, one in Bowen Island, British Columbia, and one near the French River in southern Ontario, central Ontario. Each week of the program had mentors, First Nation chiefs, people, developers, different people who have worked on renewable energy projects and had successes and worked with us to teach us the steps, the hurdles, the challenges, what they learned and how they could help us do it. The 18 of us really created a family in our first week. Each of us had similar dreams for our home communities or for the communities we're working with, and we just needed the guidance and experts to help us through. This is more or less the same thing. First Nations people learn in different ways. You can't go a cookie cutter approach with the First Nations. In the program, I mean, we had tables and we sat and we listened to PowerPoints. Then the next session we sat outside in the grass and talked. We didn't spend 5 days, 8 hours sitting at a table listening to somebody because that doesn't work for everybody. One of the things with the sticky note is an IBM presentation, and it was called, sorry, I can't remember what it was called. What was it called? Design thinking. So that was where you're clustering ideas. So each person would come up, they'd ask a question, you'd have a theme, and you use the design thinking and then cluster the ideas. And it was really neat watching the reflection of change, how this methodology worked with the First Nations people. The one night we played a game. So there's the 18 of us plus the couple mentors and the other, so 20 odd of us playing the game. It's super competitive. And the game is all about getting rid of the coal and the gas, pulling in the renewables and making partnerships and agreements. And the one photo here is the Souk First Nation. They have 300 kilowatts of solar. They've had it for many years. They own it. They have solar hot water. And the community's doing well. So they've moved into the greenhouse. So with the greenhouse, they're growing wasabi. And they're selling it to the Chinese, Japanese markets at like a rhizome like this big, like $25. So the community has done something good, and now they're doing good and more in building strength, building employment, building confidence. And these are the types of things that we want to work towards. The one picture is me sitting by the ocean, having a group session. So that's the kind of work, you had a table, you had another. Chief Jim Leonard, he's the Rainy River Chris just spoke about. Another, long table forum. We went to different communities and saw their projects. So what I really want to say about this is when you're working with First Nations, you have to come in open-minded and let them lead. When you do a presentation and you put up your 7 boards or your 12 boards or you do your PowerPoint and nobody speaks, you have to sit the next day in that room for 8 hours. They'll come back. They'll talk to you, but that first day, it's just not in their culture to react that quickly. Chris spoke about the ICE network, the online collaborative. So this has different reports, different projects, different things. When I'm working on something and I'm having a little bit of a trouble with it, you post something online and the group comes back and says, well, try this, try this, try this, look at this, what about this? And it's the First Nations working with the First Nations for the First Nations. And they support. I'm working with a community in Northern Ontario, one of the ones Tabitha spoke with, and I have 2 other that I'm trying to work with on housing, verging net zero. So it's learning from other people's experience how to build these houses so they are more efficient, cleaner air. Tabitha spoke of the mold. The mold is a big issue. So these are things like people are very good in their hearts and they want to do things, but it takes a long time and you have to commit 5, 7, 10, 15 years to make a project go ahead. So in closing, this is the chief and former chief from Dokis, and I like their feather staff. We learned a lot from each other. We bonded. The mentors, the advisors, everybody was super kind, super helpful, very giving. So it was very empowering to meet so many fantastic First Nations people working so hard to improve the quality of life for their families and community. Thank you.
My name is Claudio Canizares. I'm a professor here at University of Waterloo, as already mentioned. Pleasure of being here. Thank you for the invitation. Wise and the group here. Pleasure being part of this group. Since everybody sort of gave a bit of an idea of the background, particularly related to Native Canadian or Native American, I myself have a claim to that as well. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from here. I was born in Mexico, grew up in Ecuador. I see some Ecuadorians sitting back there, my own students. And part of my heritage, part of my genes are about 25% Native American as well. So when I was 18 years old, I was working with indigenous communities as part of a Catholic group in Ecuador. And ever since I have this interest about supporting, collaborating, helping, or whatever you want to call it, working with indigenous communities, and hence my interest in all of this work. So when I had the opportunity to start working in this area with Native communities in Canada, I welcome it very much, and it's part of my interest and part of my being as well. So it's, as Tabitha mentioned, by the way, welcome back. I understand I told you power systems, hopefully it was useful. So it's certainly an interest, a personal interest of mine, besides all the work I've done in this area. And we started this work, I would say, involved with community Casabonica Lake, which I think you might remember when we tried to develop a pilot project, but with the Hydro One funding, $10 million project, which at the end of the day didn't go through, but evolved into different projects, and eventually ended up with the work I'm going to be presenting here with Arctic communities, particularly Nunavut, in the area of Nunavut and Northwestern Territories. And most of this work was done by, as I mentioned here, Indrajit Das. You want to raise your hand? Postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Indrajit Das, did most of his work, so it's going to be presented, and any questions he's going to be answering. So basically, the outline of my presentation is going to give you a bit of motivation objectives, which were already mentioned here. What the study procedure we followed to do this particular work, which basically was divided in 2 groups, pre-feasibility and feasibility. So I'll describe that very briefly, given the limited time we have available here, and then give you a bit of conclusions and next steps. All this work, by the way, that I'm presenting here was, as mentioned here, was part of a contract collaboration with WWF, which funded this work, and we had the opportunity, and we welcome that opportunity to work with them, which is evolved now into companies interested in actually doing this type of studies to basically sell their products, which is an interesting opportunity, an interesting twist to all of this. From non-profit to non-for-profit organizations to commercial organizations. So that's something that we would like to support as well. and we are starting work with a particular company now with Indrajit. So basically, as already mentioned here, the issue of diesel power in northern communities, not only northern Ontario, but other communities as well, throughout the northern Canada, and other countries as well, is a major concern, right? We concentrate in this work in particularly 50 communities in the Canadian Arctic, and particularly in Nunavut and WWF, pardon me, and Northwestern Territories, in which we were interested in describing, identifying a certain number of communities in which pilot projects could be developed. That was the objective, the final objective of all of this work. So we were trying to do studies to determine how much renewables could be introduced to displace or move away from diesel, at what cost, and what was feasible, what was not feasible, always taking the point of view of optimal economics. So we took the basic engineering approach here. We didn't get into policy issues or special funding or special programs. We said, what can we do with just a standard economic engineering approach? So what basically was, I already mentioned, the study was divided in two parts, the pre-feasibility study, which basically was to identify 5 communities in which we would do very detailed studies in a 10 to 20 year horizon, which is the second part of this work. Now, on the pre-feasibility studies, basically what we did is we had 25 communities. We identified 13. We pre-selected 13 of those communities first, doing a sort of a back-of-the-envelope type of calculation estimations, which I'll describe very quickly. Use a particular tool to do this, which is very popular in this field, Homer, which allows you to do energy planning, particularly electrical systems energy planning. And then we basically use different stopping criteria to determine what would be the ideal sizes, right? And identify these communities based on that. Based on the savings that you basically get from not using diesel. So we basically did this fairly busy table, but basically the bottom line here is that using different criteria, given it different weights, we identify basically the 13 communities we would be working on. Okay? And based on transportation, wind resources, solar resources, etc. Now, if you're interested in the details of this analysis, of this pre-selection, selection, etc., there's reports the public reports that are available at the WWF website. Once we identified these 13 communities, then we got into a very detailed study, a more detailed study, using Homer, of what would be the ideal optimal sizes, the cost savings, etc., for these communities. And then we basically ranked them and identified 5 of them. Okay? In the case of Nunavut. And these are the 5 communities we came up with, which were very consistent with previous studies that have been done by other institutions, by other groups. So it wasn't a surprise that we basically came up with these names. Now, Iqaluit was a bit of a particular different animal, if you will, in the sense that because of the size, had different requirements, right? And we were somewhat asked to include it in the study, although there were other communities that presented bigger savings. However, from the point of view of the size, it was worth studying it as well. By the way, we did the same thing for the Northwestern Territories and identified some communities, but the interest there was in a particular one that we study in more detail. So the presentation I'm making here is specifically for Nunavut. Okay? Now, based on these pre-feasibility rankings, the bottom line, which is presented in this slide, is that, well, out of the 5 communities, 4 of these communities were identified in all different criteria we used to select them. They were always coming up, right? From depending on whether we want to minimize diesel, maximize O&M savings, minimize cost, etc. Whichever criteria we use, 4 of these communities always showed up in our results. Okay? There can be substantial reductions on CO2 because you displace diesel significantly, and with relatively lower initial investment cost. Now, that's one of the major issues with all of this, which I'll discuss, I'll mention at the end. We achieve in this case at least 36% RE penetration, which you cannot get totally off diesel, because we did look at that option. It ended up being just extremely costly. So it's just unaffordable. In one case, I think we ended up with $17 million for being able to do that. So that's something very significant. So, however, the feasibility studies resulted, which are more detailed models, resulted in better results than what we have here. So we identify these 5 communities, move on to the feasibility studies using a much more detailed model. And we use this basically framework, which was developed by Mariano Arriaga, by the way, which is a former student of mine, which was also participating on that report that was mentioned, and reporting much of the work that we did with him a project with NRCan, which is what appears in that report. And using this framework, which has basically different levels of how you select and identify the optimal communities, a lot of details here that are not that relevant. At the end of the day, what we're doing is developing first identifying the data, or selecting the data, that's more relevant. Then identifying the equipment that is more optimally or better suited for the communities, and then developing a model, optimization model, and running that model, and then getting out the results. All based on economics here. Technical issues, technical restrictions, technical constraints, and economics. Okay? So we're not looking here at a special conditions. So what we're trying to do here is build a business case. So if somebody wants to invest in this, they have a business case to do it, okay? Without having to rely on government support, etc. Now, we looked at all these options. We started with the business as usual, no RE. So what will happen in the next 20 years if you have to run the community with diesel? The next is we looked at different options, only solar, only wind, solar battery, solar and wind battery, which are all the options we looked at, okay? And yeah, do we have wind and batteries here as well? But anyway, we looked at all those options, okay? And as I said, the main objective here was to minimize the net present cost, okay? Basically the economics in a 20-year span. So we looked at all the data, we collected a lot of information, and in that regard, the local utilities were extremely useful, extremely cooperative and very friendly, and helped a lot providing all these data, which was basically hourly profiles of load, which we developed, wind speed profiles, which were available in certain cases from in most cases, I believe, from the Weather Canada, from the local airport stations, solar as well, hourly profiles, and then temperature profiles, because that have an impact, particularly in solar as well as wind. Okay? And the result I'm showing here is for Sunny Kilowatt, one of the top ranked communities. And basically what you can see here in all these plots is basically that in a 20-year horizon, all of these make sense. So you accomplish basically a maximum reduction of fuel costs when you have wind deployed. Okay? Basically you have a savings in this case of about $1.5 million. You gotta think of this in a 20-year horizon, okay? It's not a one particular year savings. So at the end of the day, it's 5.5% savings in all of this, which basically justifies. It's not only that you are using the money to do something else, but you're also saving in the process. Okay, and you have basically level of penetrations of around, in this case, in solar, wind, and battery combined, giving you savings on around, penetration of around 70% penetration. Okay. And a total savings on 10 million in this case. Okay. Now this is the bottom line, if you will. This is the results, summarizing all the results in all the communities that we study. As you can see, in all of them, there are significant savings. However, if you look at the investment, though, at the investment column, which is the major challenge, because this is funding that has to be found now, or has to be invested now. And that's one of the major roadblocks to implementing all of this. So who is going to provide this funding? In theory, the communities could be, as was mentioned by Chris, could be making loans and investing on all these, and in the process actually saving money because they have to actually pay for the electricity. However, that's a major challenge, and it's being dealt with, and it's being discussed significantly in the context of these of these communities. As you can see here, the reductions in GHG or CO2 in particular are quite significant depending on the size of the community. As you can see, Iqaluit being so big, not as much, but smaller communities, you end up in the order of 70 plus savings in terms of CO2. In case of savings in the 10-year horizon, you're talking about many millions of dollars savings in that context. So all of these makes, from the point of view of a business, makes perfect sense. Okay? That's all I have. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Klaus, a good German name. And thank you to the fine people of the WISE Institute and the University of Waterloo for having me here. I would like to share with you a bunch of success stories of solar system implementations in some of the most remote and challenging locations on this planet. The picture you see here in the middle, that's actually our Renewable Energy Technology Center in Windsor. We repurposed an old automotive factory over 8 years ago, and we have more solar and renewable energy systems there than you can shake a stick at. It's open to the public, so if you come to Windsor next time around, 1680 Kildare Road, please pay us a visit. So I will be sharing a bunch of stories. It's basically in chronological sequence because I couldn't find a better way of organizing this. So very briefly, Green Sun Rising, we're actually the longest operating solar company in southern Ontario, founded well before the Green Energy Act. And I got inspiration from my brothers and sisters back in the home country. January 2008 is when we were founded. And I also like to say we were founded for the right reasons, namely driven by physics. Politics comes and goes. Physics, not. So we do solar thermal and solar PV. And just 2.5 weeks ago, I was up in Inuvik. And I was actually the only one from our company up there and training 5 local indigenous people in solar installation, neither of whom had any done a solar installation before. It's a relatively small system, 5 kilowatt only. We shipped the material separately, and we were doing this under winter conditions. Morning temperature, never warmer than -25. One morning we had -33. Day temperature, if it was warm, we were getting to the low -20s. So operating under these conditions, working with scaffolding, for example, being on top of a steel container, working inner glove and outer glove, because if you need to work with nuts and bolts, you need to be able to have some haptic feeling, okay? And you can't do that with a thick glove. So a challenge. However, the crew did really well, and we actually did this installation in 3.5 working days. And that also included classroom-type hands-on training. We had a shop a few hundred meters away where we could actually pre-assemble and where the classroom-type thing occurred. And then we carried the equipment and went on top of the storage container for installation. This system is up and running now, and as I said, 3.5 days. You see Inuvik is up in the Beaufort Delta, not quite at the Arctic, but just about. And this visit afforded me the opportunity to get on the winter ice road and drive from Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk. This is actually the last season of that particular winter ice road. They're building a permanent all-season road. So it was fun driving out to Tuk and back. The team did really well. This is capacity building. The customer for this particular project is the Inuvialuit Corporation. And the Inuvialuit Corporation is a group of Inuit people, about 3,600 Inuit people, and they're representing a number of communities up there. So I believe there will be more of this to come. I'm now taking us to Kugluktuk. Copper mine is the old name, Kugluktuk. Well, you could claim Kugluktuk is even older because that's the original name of it. It's where the Copper Mine River flows into the Arctic. You see the curved nature of this particular roof in the background, and that was one of the challenges we had. So Kugluktuk being right at the edge of the ocean, and we did this in June. The river had broken free of the ice, but the Arctic was still frozen over. So, so far for the beginning of summer, right? In this particular case, all material had to be flown in, and it was actually flown in with a DC-3. Now that plane is between 70 and 80 years old. It's operated by Buffalo Airways, and it still represents some of the most robust aircraft you can imagine. Flying in materials means you are limited by the size of your loading door. I'll show you another project that was even more challenging, and we needed to design the size of the crates to the ability of the loading door to take it. We were talking this much, okay? And when you're up there and you're ready to load and you don't have that much, you are dead in the water. So in any case, material was flown in. Now the curved nature of that roof posed some challenges. Not only was it curved, the curvature changed along the length of the roof, and nobody could tell me the radius. So basically, we had to design a mounting system that we can on-site adjust to whatever the curvature may be. Now, by the way, we design and manufacture our own mounting system. So not only did we repurpose this old automotive factory, but we also tooled up, and we did that already before the domestic content came, because I'm not going to import hollow aluminum parts from Germany when Canada is one of the largest makers of raw aluminum, and we have local extruders. So we already were tooling up on that before domestic content ever kicked in. So we can actually design and build the mounting system to match exactly what we need. I view that as one of the key capabilities we have. So in this particular case, we have telescoping legs. And one little funny thing here, two guys did this. One of them was me. I was sitting up there one day on that roof. The average wind was 50 kilometers per hour, gusting to 70 kilometers per hour. Material was starting to move on the roof on me. Just the wind power was starting to move stuff. So they do have some interesting wind conditions up there. Now I'm moving into Iqaluit, and this is actually, it's a small system. It's less than 3 kilowatt, but it's the very first solar PV project of the utility in Nunavut, Kulik Energy. And well, we had to work not only with scaffolding, but with fall arrest. And by the way, this is February last year. That happens to be the coldest months of the year. And it was cold, rest assured. We needed to work with fall arrest, okay? And it takes you at least 10 minutes to get ready, because not only are you putting on all your warm clothes, but now you need to put fall arrest on top of that. And then you go out and do your work. You come back, and the first thing that happens, all the glasses are totally steaming up on you. I had my eyelashes freeze on me. And so working with fall arrest on scaffolding under these types of conditions has its challenges. Now, this particular system here actually is larger on the AC side than on the DC side. And under cold conditions, solar photovoltaic modules get more efficient. They have very cold air, therefore they have very dry air, which means on a clear day, you can get more than 1,000 watt per square meters. Plus, you've got all the reflections called albedo, which means Kulik Energy has a fancy data acquisition system on here. They already measured higher than 40%, higher output than rated, for the 3 very reasons I just noted. And we intend to do some digging in that data and eventually publish that. So we had another interesting event up there, total whiteout conditions. As a matter of fact, the whole town shut down and everybody was ordered to go home and basically stay inside. It has its challenges, and this particular system, we did this system and another system in 10 days. So 2 of us. And here's the other system. At the same time, we had another award. This system is for the town of Iqaluit, and it's actually on the backside of their Winter Arctic Games arena. And in this case, we also had to work with scaffolding. And here's an example of the harvest in that particular month. That system generated 441 kilowatt hours. This is actually for the Kulik energy system for the small one. And here's the larger one, 10 kilowatt on the facade. Now there are many metal facade and metal roof buildings in the north. And the further north you go in latitude, the steeper the angle we like because of the low sun angle over the horizon. And the metal facades are ideal for the type of mounting system. We design those mounting systems specific to the application. And it works beautifully. And by the way, no snow accumulation, because any snow that would want to accumulate, well, gravity and wind takes care of it, and it won't hit the module below. You don't have your valleys in between your arrays as you would have on a rooftop or ground mount. So it works really well. And just working up there, wind is another one. Temperature, you can protect yourself. You can dress warm. Wind is that really, really gets you. The wind exposure can be a big challenge. So here's an example of actually 1,090 kilowatt hours of harvest in the months of April. To put this in perspective, this is the 10 kilowatt system in 1 month. 1 liter of diesel fuel going through your diesel generator will give you about 3.5 kilowatt hours of electricity. So here, in 1 month, this one little 10 kilowatt system avoided the usage of approximately 300 liters of diesel. And that is 300 liters of diesel landed in Iqaluit, okay? Not from down here. You need to consider all of the transportation effort involved in getting the fuel up there. Here's an example of a nice sunny day. This is a 10 kilowatt system making 75 kilowatt hours on one sunny day. That's better than you would get, for example, in a place like Los Angeles. That's 7.5 full sun hours in 1 day, okay? The average we get in Ontario, Southern Ontario, over the year is 4. When we have a really good day, we have 6, okay? Here, these guys are showing 7.5 sun hours on one really good day. You can also see how it is being capped around noon. That is the system trying to generate more than 10 kilowatt DC because it's capable, even though it's rated at 10 kilowatt DC, because of the low temperature, higher irradiation, and reflection. It's actually generating more, and the inverter is just capping it off. So basically, these are the reasons why these systems, I'm going fast here, can generate more. I'm now taking you to the northernmost community in the Northwest Territories. This is Sachs Harbor on Banks Island. This, to my best of knowledge, is the northernmost microgrid connected system in all of North America. And it's a 15 kilowatt system. It floats on the permafrost. We use local gravel for ballast. In this particular case, we had to charter a plane out of Yellowknife, and the plane flew material and 2 guys into the facility. You see on the map, Banks Island, that's about 300-400 kilometers north of the mainland, and there are about 10 times as many polar bears on Banks Island than there are people. And you see a view of the community. That is the Barrens. And the tallest plant is moss and lichen, about 2 millimeters. So we did this in October. Here's us with the plane in and out with the front loader, basically not easy to get material in there. Here you can see, this is now in March, and you see how the weather is clearing. December, January, and February are admittedly a write-off. They have 10 weeks of no sun breaching the horizon due to their northern location, but you can see how the system is starting to dig out. And this is basically 1,510 kilowatt hours in March already. So, and yes, while we were there, 2 polar bears were roaming the ice on the other side of the bay. We could see them with our bare eyes. And safety from wildlife was one of the challenges there. Now I'm taking you to the largest system in the Northwest Territories done in that particular year, 82 kilowatt system. We did that 2 or 3 years ago into Colville Lake, a fly-in community, winter ice road. The material was brought in winter over the winter ice road, and we flew the team in towards the beginning of summer. Customer in this particular case was the utility Northwest Territories Power Corp. You can see where the facility is. It's north of the Arctic Circle. And here you see us flying in with a small bush hopper, non-pressurized, single engine, single pilot, and you're flying maybe 800 meters above the trees. And you can see how the material was sitting there after about 4 months or so, sitting there after winter transportation, and then our team coming in on the 1st of June, and on the 2nd of June we had snowfall. Here's a system being done. There was a phase 1 50 kilowatt, which we did not do. We did phase 2, the 83 kilowatt. Here's the aerial view. And this system is also perfectly scalable, sizable, floats on the permafrost. We only brought in the aluminum parts, used local gravel for ballast. And we used the old runway there, about a kilometer and a half outside of the village. And there was nothing other than gravel, and then in the background a few trees. So we actually used part of our crate. We cut the top off, turned it around, and created a working table. You can't work on the ground, and there is no table, there is no chair, there is no nothing. So basically you need to plan to be totally autonomous in what you do there. So here you see, this is actually the first day that we started to work and do the assembly. Here you can see we actually built a tool crate, which on the other side had a kitchen crate. And here you see our reel for the cables. When you have fat cables and you have a few hundred meters, you can't just carry that. So we actually built the whole crate around the reel in order to have this all as we needed it on the job site. We had one local guy, Kyle, work with us the whole time. He was great. And so here's 1 year's worth of harvest. And here's another system we did in the southern part of the Northwest Territories. That was the largest system done in that particular year in the Northwest Territories, owned by Housing Corp. And Housing Corp in the Northwest Territories owns about 60% of all residential housing. And you see an installation picture. Here's an aerial of it, a panoramic view. So these systems tend to go to sleep in winter because the sun just is very low on the horizon, or it just doesn't breach the horizon. In this particular case, we also have snow accumulation. But here is a good day. I mean, here you can see how full these curves are. So I very much appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Well, that was quite the panorama of presentations. I mean, Tabitha, I saw some of your former professors nodding proudly as you were speaking. I want to clarify something. When Cara said we met on the internet, it was professionally. Claudia, I'm glad that we're cousins in terms of both having Native American heritage. And you know, Klaus, we've had the Northern Arctic tour. I was saying to myself as you presented, did you think of doing more installations in the summer? But anyway, over to you folks. This is some really great information that's been provided. What questions do we have for our panel members?
Hi, Tabitha, my name is Mariano Arriaga. I have a question regarding the transmission line that gets in. What's going to happen with the communities, the 3-4 communities that won't go? Some of them are from Hydro One remotes, so which means that if Hydro One remotes is going to operate only a couple of them, maybe Hydro One remotes might disappear, and these communities might be just IPAs?
The four communities that are not economic to connect?
Yes.
There's still a discussion as to who will be the distributor for even the connected communities. So there is still the potential that Hydro One remotes would still be the distributor in those communities. But Tanakiniap is currently the transmitter only. There's no discussion that Hydro One remotes will disappear. One of those communities is currently an IPA already, Winisk. So, and the communities that are working towards projects are actually working towards a program that's offered by Hydro One remotes called the Reindeer Program, which provides funding for off diesel. So basically pays them, if they're offsetting diesel, they get paid the same rate as it would cost to provide diesel. And those are 10-year contracts currently, so.
The problem with the Reindeer program is if you get connected to the transmission line, then you go to provincial rates. And then they can get stuck with quite a big bill because they're not going to be able to get the same return.
So I think currently there's still a discussion as to what the rates will be. They would still be considered triple RP customers, and with the new changes in the provincial triple RP structure, it's not expected that their rates will increase over the reindeer rate.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
I have a question regarding use of elimination of diesel. Have you considered using algae-based biodiesel instead of diesel itself? Algae can be cultivated in a very small reactor, and you have reduced your footprint to a fingerprint there as well, and the cost we found can be less than half of what you're already paying.
Yeah.
Claudia, go ahead.
If I may, on behalf of Power Corp of the Northwest Territories, take that question, because Inuvik actually runs natural gas generation and diesel generation. So Inuvik has walked down that path. There was a time when they had natural gas provided locally, and so that made sense. The reality is that their local natural gas wells have run out, and by the way, Norman Wells is running out as well, and they are presently trucking in natural gas from British Columbia into Inuvik. And when you look at a map, how far they're trucking that natural gas, it's not a good situation.
No, my question was, have you considered using biodiesel, algae-based? It can grow indigenous. It can grow as small reactors.
Yes.
You can manufacture it then and there.
Yes, they have considered that.
Okay.
So that's been looked at.
And
However, economically didn't make sense because they couldn't produce enough biodiesel given the local conditions. There's not a lot of production of material there in terms of byproducts of
feedstock.
plants or
No, actually-
animal feeds or stuff like that.
actually, the feedstock, the traditional feedstock is seed oil, but you don't find it there. So the non-traditional feedstock comes out to be algae. Algae that is grown in small reactors.
I don't know exactly what feedstock they were looking at, but they looked at it and they didn't find it as a reasonable solution for what they have. So it didn't solve their problem. I can give you references to reports in which they have looked at this.
Yeah, I'll give a couple more pieces of information on this. The issue that Claudia and Klaus has mentioned tonight, innovative-wise, it's a good one. It works very good in tropical countries and where you have agriculture capacity. The problem is, I'll tell you, they can't grow a head of lettuce in some of these communities. There isn't I understand, we'll talk offline. I know the technology. We have tried it in Northwest Territories once, it didn't work. And so I will say there are technical challenges that are there. Technologically, there's nothing wrong with it. It is the location and the challenges in the location that have been problematic.
Yeah, and we give you a reference to a report where they look at this in detail, so you can look at it.
I can exchange some new techniques. Israelis have come up with the small reactors, very small reactor.
I've seen
and that
them.
can,
I've looked at them, I know what you're talking about. Yep.
Hi. So one of the things that I noticed across the panel was different sort of stories about what really motivates a project. So some of it began with community engagement and capacity building with communities. Claudia gave us an economic analysis. You just told us wonderful stories about success rates, success stories. But I was wondering, like across the stories, what are the ingredients you need to make one of these projects happen, whether it's wind or solar or even a transmission grid? Is economic analysis the fundamental driver? Are you using, what discount rate are you using for these 20-year timelines? So these are sort of some of the questions I had that lurking in the background of what gets one of these things going.
If I may, I think all of these factors are important. We have looked at all of these issues. We looked at the particular economic issue because we wanted to build a business case, but you need local O&M, so you need local technical expertise. The communities have to buy in, as we mentioned here. You need. We were discussing this with Klaus during the lunch. You need a local champion, because if the community is not, if there's not somebody in the community who's going to drive these, it ain't going to happen. And then you need the financial part, and that's an issue that is being looked at. For example, the government is providing is willing to provide funding. Would banks get involved? WWF is working particularly this particular issue, which is a challenging issue. The discount rate that we used was 8%, right?
Yeah, I think,
Klaus, yeah, Tabitha, then Klaus, a brief comment, and Cara, if you'd like.
I think I would really echo the community champion, especially in a number of communities where your chief and council's elections are happening every 2, sometimes 3 years, depending on their council. You really need someone in the community who's going to continue that through changing in political leadership. And this transmission project definitely has that. I don't know if you've seen on the agenda on TVO recently, it was Margaret Kanakwanesh, and she's the president of Wataynikaneyap Power, and she's a force, and she has done a lot of work to push this project through within communities and in the tribal council. I think that's a huge part. And as I said too, you need to have community buy-in. But the economic business case needs to be there in order to get funding. So currently that economic business case is what we're using in discussions with the federal government and the provincial government on who's going to fund this project and how's the project going to get paid for.
I would say the biggest challenge is really status quo, just overcoming the inertia of the present status quo. I believe there is a groundswell of positive inclination towards renewable energy in these communities. And if you've ever stood next to the diesel generator as it's going 24 hours a day, and you see all the smoke and basically all the soot in the snow around you, people know that the diesel generator is a necessary evil but an ongoing disturbance. So there is a groundswell of desire to reduce that. What often is not the case is knowing the steps and putting it all together, the puzzle. So I can only echo again the need of a local champion to do that. Often money can be found, and we work with various communities, and funding generally is an obstacle, but if there is the desire to do so and there is enough support, that can be overcome. And I view this as a journey. We have at least 20 years work to do to reduce diesel generation in all these communities. It's definitely an improvement in quality of life. In Colville Lake, that system is coupled with a battery storage, and something happened that the community had not experienced before. They shut the diesel down. Even the guys who operate the diesel initially didn't believe it could be done, okay? They shut the diesel down. And for half an hour, the community experienced something they had not experienced before for decades. Perfect quiet, okay? And that has to be the goal, okay? At least in the favorable half of the year. That's where we need to get in the next 10 to 20 years, that we shut the diesel down for extended periods of time as long as combination of solar and wind is readily available. For winter, it will likely continue to be a necessary evil for more time to come, but ultimately shutting the diesel down in the favorable time of the year, that's such an improvement in quality of life.
Okay. Cara, do you want to make a comment?
I believe that a lot of the holdup is fear, community fear. I wrote lack of experience in engaging, so you have a community champion, and she does not have the experience engaging, so it's training, teaching your champion to be more champion. Something that I have noticed is one elder will say no, so then that's it, it's done. So you need to be able to work with the elder and find out why they said no, because if the elders are against it, then it'll never happen. One of the chiefs that I was speaking with recently talked about outside support. So initially they wanted the project, but they couldn't get the funders, so they had to get a partner. But once they did the project, they found out they could have done it on their own, which they wanted, but the funder wouldn't support. So another chief I spoke with said, you get the power purchase agreement and the funders and everybody will come. So there's a lot of things that have, a lot of improvement that have gone on. There's a lot more ownership in the last 6, 8, 10 years in the community. So the lessons are being learned. and the lessons are being shared within the community, so it is changing. But having a community champion and having the elder support is key to any success.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're at our time, but before I ask you to join me in thanking the panel, I'll remind you that we're wrapping up the day, which I'll turn to Jatan in a moment. But I would say that you can't leave. I enjoyed talking to a couple of the student presentations on the storyboards and infographics. Please go at least talk to one or two of them, and some of the other presentations are there, some great information from some participating organizations. So do that before you head off to the rest of your day. But before we hand off to Jatan, please join me in thanking the panel.